Welcome to ePathshala. I am Dr. Vishal Jadhav, Associate Professor, Department of Sociology, Tilak Maharashtra Vidya-mitra, Pune. Today we are going to look at a module called Protestant Ethic Thesis. During the 19th century and early 20th century in Germany, Marxism to a great extent had flourished. Marx, who had based his theory on the materialist history of human development, had seen how capitalism was an emergent stage or an emergent phase that had emerged from feudalism, and it had emerged based on the materialist conditions given in human society at that point of time. Weber questioned this thesis and asked if there could be an alternative way of understanding how capitalism emerged in Western Europe. This module will seek to answer that question. Weber on religion. Unlike his predecessors, Weber was not concerned about understanding the structure of religion. His main aim was to study how religion is acting as a driving force of social change. In the Sociology of Religion, at the outset of his study of religion, Weber noted that his study was not to seek the essence of religion, but to study the conditions and effects of a particular type of social action. Weber lays out this thesis that people pursue their interests and that religious leaders and structures help people achieve these goals. In this way, religion provides the tools for both stability and social change. Weber's understanding of religion is based on his notion of aestheticism, which plays an important role in the understanding of his concept of religion and the development of capitalism. Weber did not give proper definition of asceticism, but instead has classified the notion of asceticism into inner worldly asceticism and world-rejecting asceticism. Herein, he tried to show that the path of salvation for various religions is different and is dependent on the ethical behavior of the individual as prescribed by the respective religious doctrines. In his own words, salvation may be viewed as the distinctive gift of active ethical behavior performed in the awareness that God directs this behavior. That is, the actor is an instrument of God. We shall designate this type of attitude towards salvation, which is characterized by methodical procedures for achieving religious salvation, as ascetic. In his classification of the notion of inner worldly asceticism and world-rejecting asceticism, he stated that the world-rejecting asceticism has been the primary essence of religions of Asia, including Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. By world-rejecting asceticism, he meant that those religions which preach the essence of rejecting the worldly affairs as worthless, controlling temptations and following the path of penance as a mode to attain salvation. On the other hand, for Weber, Protestantism preached the essence of inner worldly asceticism, which preached the notion of transforming the world by ideals of asceticism and strives to make the world fulfill religious demands. On the basis of this classification, Weber explores his study on world religion, which includes the study of Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, Judaism, and Protestantism. Herein, his main aim was to seek the causal linkage between religion and progress in the respective societies dominated by the aforesaid religious doctrines. Weber wanted to have a comparative view of the causal linkages between religion and growth of capitalist ideology. In this regard, he has studied the economic ethic of religions. Economic ethic of religion refers to the practical impulses of action which are found on the psychological and pragmatic context of religion. Let us have a brief understanding of his study on the world religions. In his study of Hinduism, he stated that this religion prescribes otherworldly asceticisms as the sole path of attaining salvation. Weber stated that Hindu doctrine of karma, the process of reincarnation and compensation on the basis of one's deed, was inherently otherworldly in nature, which links individuals' work as per his caste obligation. At the same time, this religion celebrates the idea of life after death. Thus, he argues that Hinduism preached otherworldly asceticism, which stressed on disenchantment of the material, which is not given importance as it is regarded to be temporary and illusory. His study of Buddhism stresses that this religion preaches the idea of detachment of material pursuit. For him, Buddhism prescribes the idea of penance and relinquishing world pleasures as the exclusive path of salvation. Thus, again, for him, societies dominated Buddhist religion did not attain economic progress. Weber had also done a detailed study on the religions of China. In his magnum opus, The Religions of China, he had studied Confucianism. In his study, the Confucianism, he stated that this religion celebrated the spirit of humanism and nurturing human qualities and reaching to the level of perfection by self-creation and self-cultivation. For Weber, Confucianism acted as an impediment in the development of economic rationalization since it proscribed the development of professional specialization. In his study on Judaism, he believed that this religion could have acted as the basic source for the development of industrial capitalism, but in reality they were unsuccessful because of certain historical obligations. According to him, this religion invokes for the path of ethical salvation and thus could not allow for capitalist mode of development. Weber did not have a positive view on Christianity or Catholicism, to be precise. For Weber, Catholicism was traditionalist in its spirit and did not facilitate the development of capitalism. For him, Catholicism was based on the ideals of hierarchy, where there was a sheer division between elites and lay people. According to Paul Honingsheim, Weber was an unconditional opponent of Catholicism. Weber stated that Catholicism is based on the principle of polytheism and indulged in magical practices. In this way, it acted as an impediment to the development of capitalist growth. Finally, it can be aptly remarked that Weber had found Protestantism as the only religion which facilitated the development of economic rationality, and with it, he showed how in Western Europe the zenith of development in comparison to that of Asia emerged, where religions did not act as a catalyst in the development of capitalist society. Weber on Protestantism. Weber's magnum opus, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, is based on two important themes. One was to launch a causal relationship between Protestantism and the development of capitalism, and the other was to establish a line of continuity between the Protestant ethical maxims and the path of development taken by Western capitalism and its regulation of economic conduct by the imposition of restraint and rejection of luxury. In this way, by highlighting Protestant religious doctrines, he wanted to establish Protestantism as the third worldly religion. For Weber, in contrast to other religions which prescribed other world asceticism, Protestantism encouraged inner worldly asceticism as the path for attaining salvation. Thus, for him, Protestant religious doctrines stressed on hard work, dedication, and efficiency in one's worldly calling. Protestantism thus stressed on active worldly activities as a path to attain salvation. Weber, in his exploration of Protestantism, has found four forms of ascetic Protestantism: Calvinism, second, Pietism, third, Methodism, and fourth, the sects growing out of the Baptist movement. Let us have a detailed overview of the following forms of Protestantisms. Calvinism. The teaching of John Calvin and the churches in the Reformed tradition form the main group of Calvinists. The most widely known group in this tradition are the Huguenots of France, the Calvinists of Geneva, the Reformed churches of Holland, the Puritans of England and New England, and the Presbyterian churches in Scotland and North America. Calvin was born in France, studied law, classics and Hebrew, and then turned his attention and energies to the Reformation, opposing conservative theological teachings. His writings against papacy and arguing for justification by faith alone were influential, and in 1836 he went to Geneva to carry through Reformation work and to write. After disagreements with the people of Geneva, he left, but in 1541 was called back to Geneva, where he constructed a government based on subordination of state to church. Laws and regulations were rewritten so that daily life was subject to church doctrines and practices. While he opposed exploitation and self-indulgence, Calvin favored trade and production and was not antagonistic to capitalism that was developing around him and among his followers. In Scotland, it was John Knox who developed Calvin's idea and helped establish Presbyterianism as the official religion. Knox worked with Calvin and incorporated elements of Calvinist doctrines in Scotland. Calvinism for Weber was one of the dominant forms of ascetic Protestantism, which assumed its main area of influence in Western Europe, especially the 17th century. One of the most important themes of Calvinism was its belief in the doctrine of predestination. Thus, they believe that God preordains which people are saved and which people are damned. Calvinists came to this idea from logical necessity. Men exist for the sake of God, and to apply earthly standards of justice to God is meaningless and insulting. His decrees can only be understood or even known to us insofar as it has been His pleasure to reveal them. We can only hold to these fragments of eternal truth. Everything else, including the meaning of our individual destiny, is hidden in dark mystery, which it would be impossible to pierce and presumptuous to question. Thus, the Calvinist assumes that people who are damned can never challenge this preordination of the external power. Calvinism believed that God has always chosen a small proportion of human population to whom He bestows eternal grace. At the same time, the other percentage of population is known to be damned, which are debarred from His eternal grace. At the same time, for Weber, this decree could not be changed with repentance and penance, since they had already been predicated. For Weber, this resulted in creating an anxiety among the followers with regard to being saved or damned. Calvinist ideology believed that the fate of predestination cannot be changed, not even with the help of any priests or any sacraments. Henceforth, it can be concluded that Calvinism brought with it a new idea by completely eliminating the dominance of church in attaining salvation. Calvinism at the same time also eliminated the importance of magic as a medium of attaining God's grace for those who have been denied God's grace. Weber herein stated that this suspicion of whether we are the saved ones or not, resulted in increasing the anxiety among the followers. In this regard, Calvinism had also stated the way to solve this anxiety. Calvinist principles stress that the traces of signals of the doctrine of predestination can be found in the elementary forms of conduct and attitude towards life. Calvinism stresses on complete trust on God and not on any other medium. Calvinists rejected all sensual and emotional elements of culture and religion. Such elements were not a means to salvation, and they promoted superstition. The Calvinist interaction with God was carried out in spiritual isolation. There was social organization because laboring for impersonal social usefulness was believed to be required by God. Calvinism rejected the mystical elements of Lutheranism, where humans were a vessel to be filled by God. Rather, Calvinists believed that God worked through them. Faith had to be shown in objective results. They looked for any activity that increased the glory of God. Such conduct could be based directly in the Bible or indirectly through the purposeful order of God's world. Good work were not a means to salvation, but they were a sign of having been chosen. Weber observes that Calvinism expected systematic self-control and provided no opportunity for forgiveness of weakness. The God of Calvinism demanded of his believers not single good works, but a life of good work combined into a unified system. This was a rational and systematic approach to life. Since people had to prove their faith through worldly activity, Calvinism demanded a kind of worldly asceticism. It led to an attitude towards one's neighbor's sins that was not sympathetic, but rather full of hate, since he was God's enemy, bearing signs of eternal damnation. After presenting the doctrines of Calvinism, Weber turns his attention to the study of other three Protestant religions, where he started with the study of Pietism. Pietism was a movement in the Lutheran Church, primarily in North and Central Germany, between 1670s and 1750s. It was an effort to stir the church out of the settled attitude in which dogma and intellectual religion seemed to be supplanting the Bible and religion of the heart. It emphasized Bible study and the belief that lay members of the church should have a say in spiritual control. While similar to the Puritanism in having distinctive dress and renunciation of worldly pleasures, its primary aim was to place spirit of Christian living above the letter of the doctrine. This movement was influential on Count Zinzendorf of the Moravian Church and on Kant and Kierkegaard. It was not so much a formal religion as a movement within the church. Weber, in his doctoral thesis, has stated that historically the doctrine of predestination is the starting point of Pietism. Thus, it can be interpreted that Pietism is closely connected with that of Calvinism, since both these forms of ascetics, Protestantism, held predestinations as one of their important doctrines. Pietism had a deep distrust on the church of the theologians. They wanted to reduce the importance of the church and the theologians into the social affairs. At the same time, they did not want to form a separate sect, but wanted to live in a community, a life freed from all temptations of the world and in all its details dictated by God's will. In this regard, they look for signs of rebirth in their daily activity. Weber also notes that some pieties were more emotional and adopted many Lutheran doctrines approaches. So pieties were not as systematically ascetic in their approach to daily life. Weber, in his magnum opus, had stressed on the virtues propagated by Pietism. In his own words, but again and again, in so far as the rational and ascetic elements of Pietism outweighed the emotional, the ideas essential to a thesis maintained their place. These were: 1. The methodical development of one's own state of grace to a higher and higher degree of certainty and perfection in terms of the law was a sign of grace. 2. That God's providence works through those in such a state of perfection, that is, in that He gives them His signs if they wait patiently and deliberately, methodically. Labor in a calling was also the ascetic activity par excellence, for the God Himself blessed His chosen ones through the success of the labors was undeniable to Him, and we shall find it to have been to the Puritans. With reference to the above quoted paragraph, it can rightly be said that Pietism believed that methodical developments of one's state of grace in terms of the law was a given sign of grace. Second, God gives sign of grace if one longs for it patiently while doing good human activity. Pietism had an indecisive basis for its asceticism that made it less reliable than Calvinism. This is partly due to Lutheran influences and partly due to emotional. Weber herein notes that virtues favored by Pietism were far those on the one hand of the faithful officials, clerk, laborer or domestic worker, and on the other of the predominantly patriarchal employer. This is in contrast with the legalist Calvinists and the active enterprise of the bourgeoisie capitalist entrepreneurs. Weber now comes to the third form of ascetic Protestantism and its Methodism. Methodism emerged in the 1720s in England under the leadership of John and Charles Wesley. This group became termed Methodists because of the emphasis on living by rule and method. They emerged out of the Church of England but emphasized conversion and loneliness. Their early meetings were often in the fields of barns, perhaps an early form of the tent meeting revivals of later evangelists in North America. There are various branches today, with some churches calling themselves Methodist. Methodism for Weber represented a combination of emotional yet ascetic religion with an increasing indifference to Calvinism's doctrinal bias. Its strong characteristic was its methodical, systematic nature of concern, and the method was used primarily to bring about the emotional act of conversion. The feeling of grace was necessary for salvation. Part of the doctrine of Methodism was a belief in underserved possession of divine grace and the same time of immediate consciousness and justification and forgiveness. Baptist sects. For Weber, Baptist sects form an important forms of ascetic Protestantism around the 16th and 17th century. Baptist sects includes the Baptists, Mennonites, and above all, Quakers. According to Weber, this group had a different opinion than that of Calvinism, especially with reference to ideas of predestination. Thus, it can be stated that the Baptist sects form an independent source of ascetic Protestantism other than Calvinism. These sects are unified by the idea of believers' church, a community of personal believers of the reborn. They believed that salvation can be reached through individual revelation, and one had to wait for the Spirit and avoid sinful attachments to the world. Weber notes that these doctrines form an independent basis for Protestant asceticism. While Baptists reject predestination, they do advocate the quieting of all passion so that Christians can enter into their quiet repose of soul where they can hear God's voice each day. Through the detailed work on various forms of ascetic Protestantism, it can be aptly stated that from Weberian understanding that Protestants agreed that salvation could not be guaranteed by magical sacraments, confessions, or individual good works. What was needed was a form of proof that would satisfy Christians about their status. For the Protestants, this matter pertained to individuals, not to monasteries or the church. Weber's link between Protestantism and capitalism. Weber's magnum opus has always been centered on the theme of link between development of Protestantism and capitalism. Weber developed his thesis on the basis of certain key assumptions, that is, economic forces influence religion, religious system influences individual thought and actions. Religious ideas have been the unique effect to rationalize the economic sector. Protestantism as a value has proved to be conducive to economic development. Non-Western religious ideas acted as impediments in the development of rationalization and economic development. Weber, in a study on world religion, has classified all religion into world rejecting asceticism and inner worldly asceticism. Here he concluded that Protestantism can be regarded as an inner worldly religion. While dealing with Protestantism, he deals with its ideal and found that uncertainty of whether they were the few ones to get salvation has been one of the reasons for the people of this religion to work diligently, which was the only way to uncover the sign of salvation. Thus, in sum, Calvinism as a religion acts as a direct link to intense world activities and champions hard work. To conclude then, unlike Marx, who believes that economic systems define human history and the stages of human development, Weber, on the other hand, came up with a theory that suggested that the Protestant ethic within which Calvinism was responsible for development of some kind of individuality, and this kind of individuality and private ownership and the idea of striving for hard work and labor to prove oneself in front of God resulted in the development of capitalism. This definitely was in contrast to what Marx had to say about the emergence of capitalism.